Let me tell you something serious at the outset. If you get possessed, targeted, or followed by something, it's no joking matter. Another thing I'll tell you from my experience is that it's hardly ever the case that things are sorted with one or two exorcisms. It's probably because you're slowly eroded over a long time. More often than not, it seems that they can't exorcise it. In my case, it was about 2.5 years. Just for the record, I'm able-bodied and living a life just like anyone else. However, unfortunately, I'm not sure if it's over. I'll start with the beginning. I was 23 at the time, in my first year as a working adult, and was having a hard time adjusting to my new life. The company was small, so there were naturally very few people who joined at the same time as me, which meant we inevitably became close. One of them was a guy named Ken from the Tohoku region. He knew a lot of stuff and had a lot of acquaintances, which is why we became friends. You know how there are stories like, if you do this, you'll get this, or if you do this, this will come, right? I think most of them are fallacies, but apparently some of them aren't, and certain conditions that just happen to align could lead to them happening, according to Ken. In my case, it was mostly due to a prank. At the time, I had just bought a car, hadn't been living alone for long, and was earning significantly more than I did during my part-time jobs. So I spent my weekends just fooling around. In early August, 4 of us, Ken, some girls we'd picked up, and myself, went to test our nerves at what's known as a haunted spot. The place was definitely scary, and I felt chills and a sense that something was there, but nothing really happened. We enjoyed the thrill and went home. Then, 3 days later, I did something I shouldn't have in front of the mirror at the entrance to my apartment when I got home tired from work. The company I worked for at the time had an unspoken rule that newcomers couldn't leave until their seniors did, which meant I regularly got home late. I can't understand why I did it, even now. I wasn't thinking about it or planning to test it, I just happened to think of it. Let me give you a detailed description. My apartment at the time was a 15-minute walk from the station, a one-room, 8-tatami mat space. There was a narrow corridor when you entered the entrance, and past that was the 8-matami room. I had a mirror at the entrance to the room, meaning it was at the boundary between the corridor and the room. What I heard from Ken was that if you do this in front of a mirror and look to the right, something will be there. So I was in a bowing-like posture and murmured something like, "There's no way anything will happen." When I looked to the right, that's when I saw it. There was something in the middle of my room. The appearance was clearly abnormal. It was probably around 160 centimeters tall. Its hair was unkempt and down to its waist, and it was draped over its face like a curtain. It had multiple paper charms stuck to its face, so I couldn't see it. I don't know what to call it, but it was wearing a white kimono-like garment for the deceased, while swinging slightly from left to right. I was stunned. I couldn't make a sound, and my body was entirely frozen, but my mind was spinning at an incredible speed, trying to make sense of what was happening. Imagine this. There's something in the middle of your small one-room apartment in a completely silent room. While your mind knows exactly why it's happening, it's whirling in confusion, unable to comprehend what's actually going on. It was freaky. I had the lights on, but that made it even scarier because I could see this thing. There was a bluish tinge around it. It was so quiet that I felt as though time had stopped. The conclusion I came to was to leave the room. I slowly, gently picked up my bag that was at my feet. I couldn't take my eyes off the thing. I thought it would be dangerous to look away. As I backed away halfway down the corridor, it took a lot of time, despite the fact that it normally only takes 3 steps. The thing began to shake its body from side to side more vigorously and started emitting a moaning sound. After that, I don't really remember much. Next thing I knew, I was in a convenience store in front of the station. At any rate, I was relieved to be in a convenience store with people, but my head was still in a state of confusion. I was feeling a sensation akin to anger, thinking, what the hell was that? And there was also a weirdly calm part of me thinking, I forgot to lock the door. I didn't have the courage to go back to my room that night, and ended up spending the whole night in a diner waiting for morning. When dawn started to break, I hesitantly opened the door to my room. I was relieved. Whatever it was had disappeared. Before entering my room, I went outside one more time to have a smoke while sipping on a canned coffee. I was beginning to think that maybe there was nothing there after all. I mean, what happened was simply unbelievable. Since it was getting light and the thing was gone, I started to feel a bit more relaxed. As I entered my room with slightly more courage than before, I thought to myself, all right, it's not here, and turned on the lights, which were dim due to the curtains being closed. A sight that confirmed last night's incident came into view. A horrendous amount of incredibly smelly mud, probably sludge, I guess, sat where that thing was last night, far exceeding the level of footprints could be left. It didn't take long for me to reaffirm what had happened. To my horror, I realized that I didn't turn off the lights. Haha, looking at my left hand, which I used to turn on the switch, mud was sticking to this side too. Although I couldn't get over the gloomy feeling for a while, I figured there was nothing I could do about what had already happened. Well, it's typical for someone with AB blood type like me to think that way. So while I was in that state, I cleaned up the mud, took a shower, and went to work. The smell didn't go away, which was quite upsetting, and while that was a big concern, taking a day off from work was another big deal. When I got to work, my usual mundane daily life awaited me. Somehow, I found time to talk to Ken. Ken was involved in the beginning of the whole thing, so I was trying to get some information from him. During lunch break, I finally succeeded in catching him. Below are excerpts from the conversation between me and Ken. You remember the story you told before, right? If you do this, that will come. Well, I did it yesterday and it came. Huh? What are you talking about? I said something really happened. Don't mess around. Huh? I don't get it. I don't get it either. Damn it, we're not getting anywhere. Since I couldn't proceed without making Ken believe, I calmly explained what happened last night. Even Ken, who initially thought it was a joke, has finally become half convinced. After work, Ken agreed to come to my room to check it out. At 10 p.m., thankfully, Ken and I were able to leave work early and arrive at my room. As soon as I opened the door, the foul smell that I smelled this morning assaulted my nose. The stench, along with the heat, hit me from behind the closed door. On the way back home, Ken, who had been repeatedly explained by me, muttered, "For real?" He seemed to believe me. The problem was whether Ken could come up with some kind of solution, but it was not promising. Anyway, he suggested going to a purification ceremony and asking a friend, then went home as if escaping. Although it was as I expected, I had high hopes because of his wide connections. Due to the unpleasant smell, I decided to stay in a capsule hotel that night. I was definitely thinking that if it came out again tonight, it would be the end. The next day, I went to a nearby temple as a first step. I couldn't think about work at that point. When I explained the situation to the monk, he gave me a laid-back answer. "I'm not a specialist, so I don't know. Why don't you take it easy for a while? It's probably all in your head." That's how the world works. That day, I visited several famous temples and shrines in Tokyo, but they all gave me similar responses. Exhausted, I decided to rely on my grandparents' house in Saitama. To be precise, I wanted to consult with a nun named S-san, who my maternal grandmother owes a great deal to. Well, I couldn't think of anyone else who would take me seriously. Here I introduce S-san. My mother is from Nagasaki Prefecture, so naturally my grandmother is also there. My grandmother is a fervent Buddhist, probably because of her experience during the war. S-san is the priestess of the temple where my grandmother goes once a week. I've met her a few times. Although I don't know the details, she has served Buddha in a solid way incomparable to any quasi-spiritualists, since the name of her sect is written in textbooks. Her personality is gentle, and she speaks in a calm and kind way. When I was about to enter junior high school, my father bought a piece of land and decided to build a house. I think it's called a groundbreaking ceremony. Anyway, that land was purified. 1 week later, my grandmother in Nagasaki called and said, "The land is not good, San will go to purify it." Naturally, my mother was like, "Why? It's already done." Then my grandmother said, "But S-san says there's still something left." In other words, the person who seemed likely to be the only one I could rely on as far as I knew was Ms. S. By the time I arrived at the bus stop near my parents' house in Saitama, it was just before 9 p.m. and getting dark. Unlike in Tokyo, this is a town full of factories, so it's not very crowded even at 9 p.m. I walked briskly for about 20 minutes from the bus stop to my parents' house. Street lights are lined up regularly on a dark street without many people. Inwardly, I was quite scared because the events of the day before yesterday were flashing back, but luckily it didn't show up. But with the cooling of the night, I noticed a change in my body. There seems to be some sort of heat around the base of my neck. It's hard to describe, but it feels as though a string has been tied around my neck and is being pulled from side to side. When I put my hand on my neck, I felt a chill. It was hot, only the neck was hot, and it started to tingle. It seems that there was something like a rash. I was unable to continue walking and ran to my parents' house with all my might. Just as my breathless self was opening the front door of the house, my mother was hanging up the phone, and she immediately said this as soon as she saw my face. "Oh, your grandmother in Nagasaki just called and said she's worried. Miss S said you're not doing well and told her to have you come over here." "Did you do something? Oh dear, what happened to your neck?" Before I could answer, I looked in the entrance hall mirror. I didn't even think about whether it might come. For some reason, the base of my neck, right where it joined, was perfectly lined with a red line as if it had been tied with a rope. Upon closer inspection, small rashes were densely popping out. I began to tremble slightly. Without thinking, I ran up the stairs without saying a word to my mother and repeated Namu Amida Butsu in front of the small Buddhist statue in my mother's room. I couldn't do anything else. My worried father shouted, "What happened?" as he ran over. My mother, sensing something was wrong, was on the phone with my grandmother. I could hear my mother's voice. It was a crying voice. I finally understood that there was no escape and that I was in a terrible situation. It's been 3 days since I came home and understood the situation I was in. I don't know if it was because I was mentally drained or because of something it had caused, but I was plagued by a high fever for 2 days. I sweated a sickening amount from my neck, and blood started to seep out by the middle of the second day. The bleeding from my neck had stopped by the morning of the third day. It was only a little to begin with. The fever had dropped to a mild one, and I was a bit calmer. However, there was an abnormal itchiness around my neck. It was prickly and itchy, and a sharp small pain ran through me whenever a pillow, futon, or towel touched it. Thinking that the scab was itchy from the blood, I tried to avoid touching it deliberately. I burrowed into the futon and tried not to care until evening, but I couldn't help but look in the mirror when I went to the bathroom. Even though I didn't want to look in the mirror, I just couldn't rest unless I confirmed what was happening to me with my own eyes. The mirror reflected a situation I had never seen before. The redness around my neck had completely receded. In its place, the rash had grown larger. I still get goosebumps every time I think about it. It was disgusting, but I want to describe it in detail. Please don't mind. The original line around my neck was about 1 centimeter thick. That area turned bright red, contrasting sharply with my naturally very fair skin, making it look as if a red string had been wound around my neck. This was 3 days ago. The area reflected in the mirror in front of me was filled with pus. No, that's not accurate. To be precise, the rash that had formed the red line was filled with pus, as if a giant pimple was crammed in there. Most of them were oozing pus, and I vomited on the spot because it was so unsightly and nauseating. I washed my neck with clear water, borrowed some ointment from my mother, applied it, and returned to the futon crying. I couldn't think of anything else. The only thing on my mind was resentment. Why me? When I was worn out from crying, my cell phone rang. It was from Ken. Do you know that even a little bit of hope can become an incredible energy at times like this? Honestly, I've never been so happy to receive a call. Hello? Oh, are you okay? Of course I'm not okay. Ah, so it's really bad? It's worse than bad. Sigh. Anyway, isn't there anything we can do? I asked some friends back home, but I couldn't find anyone who knew. Ah, so